Imagine returning home from a war that tested every limit of your body and mind, only to find the world mostly unchanged. The streets still crawled with ordinary cars, factories hummed with civilian production, and your own dreams waited to ignite. But for a group of engineers and mechanics in post-war Los Angeles, something had shifted. They came back from the Pacific Theater and European fronts with more than memories. They carried mechanical skills forged in aircraft maintenance, tank repair shops, and naval shipyards. They had combat pay in their pockets, and they had an appetite for something the Depression and the war had stolen from them, the thrill of the machines they controlled. In quiet garages scattered across Los Angeles, these returning veterans didn't build machines for war anymore. They had the Flathead V8. They had wrenches, aluminum, and an obsession with speed that no peacetime economy could suppress. What they would create there in those converted workshops, on the dry lake beds north of the city, and in the first speed shops America had ever seen, would not just change cars, it would birth an entire culture. This is the story of how a handful of World War II engineers and mechanics didn't invent hot rodding, but rather transformed it from a hidden pre-war cult into the greatest automotive revolution in American history. Before Pearl Harbor, hot rodding already existed, but it was a whispered thing. In the late 1920s and throughout the 1930s, young men in Southern California had discovered something simple and profound. Old cars could go fast. Cheap Ford Model Ts and Model As, stripped of everything unnecessary, raced across the dry lake beds north of Los Angeles. Mirage, Muroc, Harper. 50 miles of open desert where a teenager with a cheap car and a wrench could challenge the laws of motion with nothing but the howl of an engine and the smell of hot metal. These early rodders were not engineers with degrees. They were mechanics' sons, gas station attendants, and farm boys who understood machines the way sailors understood the sea. They learned by breaking things and fixing them. By 1932, Ford introduced the Flathead V8, a revolutionary engine that delivered 65 horsepower straight from the factory, mass-produced by the millions, and cheap enough that a junkyard could supply you with 3. Young men named Ed Iskenderian and Vic Edelbrock were teenagers during this era, watching their elders tinker with these machines, learning the language of horsepower. By the late 1930s, the culture had taken root. In Beverly Hills, a sharp-eyed mechanic named Vic Edelbrock Sr. designed and built the first slingshot manifold for his 1932 Ford Roadster, a simple aluminum intake that allowed 2 carburetors to feed the hungry V8. His friends wanted one. Then strangers did. By 1938, Edelbrock Corporation was born, not from a business plan, but from mechanical necessity. A few years later, when war clouds gathered, Ed Iskenderian was still a teenager in Los Angeles, building his first hot rod, a beautiful black Model T with a maxi head and an Edelbrock manifold, clocking 120 miles per hour on the salt flats. But then came December 7th, 1941. The music stopped. Racing ceased overnight. The government banned auto racing to conserve fuel and rubber for the war effort. The SCTA, the Southern California Timing Association, disbanded. The dry lake beds fell silent. The young men who had tasted speed disappeared into a different kind of war. Vic Edelbrock Sr. worked the Long Beach shipyards, welding and hand-fabricating aircraft parts, his machinist's hands now serving a different purpose. Ed Iskenderian volunteered for the Army Air Corps, trading the roar of a V8 for the thunder of B-17 engines and the terrible responsibility of keeping America's bombers flying. Thousands of other mechanics scattered across the globe, aircraft maintenance crews in the Pacific, tank mechanics grinding through North Africa, naval engineers below decks in the Atlantic. They worked in bunkers and engine rooms, under fire and under pressure, perfecting their craft in conditions that would have broken most people. But war has a strange way of teaching you things you'll need in peacetime. In those workshops and repair depots, a mechanic learned to maximize efficiency under impossible conditions. He learned to fabricate parts when supplies didn't exist. He learned to make something run on fumes and willpower. He learned that the mind of an engineer was as valuable as his hands. These skills, born from trauma and necessity, would become the foundation of an entirely new culture when the war finally ended. The veterans who returned in 1945 and 1946 weren't the same young men who left. Some carried wounds, some carried ghosts, and all of them carried something else, a desperate hunger for normalcy, for freedom, for the simple privilege of building something for themselves instead of for survival. They came home to a country eager to move on, to forget the war, to buy new houses and new cars. But these returning engineers couldn't let go of what they'd learned. They couldn't go back to being gas station attendants. And they couldn't suppress the knowledge that they had mastered machines in ways most civilians never would. Los Angeles in 1945 was a different place than it had been in 1941. The city had exploded during the war. Aircraft factories, shipyards, defense contractors. Hundreds of thousands of people had migrated west looking for war work. Now, with the war over, they had money, ambition, and displacement. The housing shortage was acute. Jobs were plentiful but often unfulfilling. Young men in particular found themselves restless, with mechanical skills that peacetime had no obvious use for. For many of these veterans, Los Angeles held a promise. It was warm, it was new, and importantly, it was the place where hot rodding had roots. Word had spread during the war. Servicemen who had passed through California on their way to the Pacific had written letters home describing the strange, beautiful cars tearing through the desert. They'd described the freedom. And when they came home, whether to Chicago or Detroit or rural Kansas, they looked back at California as the promised land. By late 1945, as the war wound down and servicemen began mustering out, something was stirring in Southern California. The dry lake beds that had been silent for 4 years began to echo again. Not officially, racing was still technically banned, but informally, covertly, in those first chaotic months before the government managed to reassert control over the playa beds north of Los Angeles. Young men were tuning their engines again. They were meeting at night. And they had something the pre-war rodders never had: military training in mechanical engineering, veterans' benefits money, and a burning psychological need to reclaim the thrill they'd been denied for 4 years. For many of these men, hot rodding was more than a hobby. It was therapy. In the years after the war, psychology had no language for what we'd now call PTSD, but these returning servicemen lived with something that needed an outlet. The constant adrenaline, the danger, the hyper-focus required in wartime, all of it had rewired their nervous systems, and now, in peacetime, they felt unmoored. Building a hot rod was a way to reclaim control. In war, you followed orders and hoped you survived. In a garage, with an engine block in front of you, you made decisions that determined outcomes. You built something faster, more powerful, more beautiful than it was before. Every modification was a small victory. Every time you heard that engine roar to life, you knew your hands and your brain had made it happen. There was no trauma in that, no randomness, only skill and will. The racing itself served the same purpose. On the salt flats, staring down a 3-mile course at Muroc or El Mirage, a driver felt what he hadn't felt since combat: genuine, productive adrenaline. The kind that focused you rather than scattered you. The kind that proved you were still alive, still capable, still worthy. And because it was dangerous in a controlled way, not like war, where danger was random and total, it provided the rush without the existential terror. This psychological element would become central to hot rodding's culture. It wouldn't always be articulated. The builders and drivers of the late 1940s didn't sit down and analyze why they needed this. But they knew, intuitively, that what they were building in those garages was not just cars, it was identity. It was freedom. It was proof that the war hadn't taken everything from them. By 1946, the first speed shops were opening. Carl Orr opened his shop in Culver City, the first dedicated post-war speed shop in America. Down on San Fernando Road in Los Angeles, Paul Chappell's speed shop began supplying parts exclusively designed to make cars faster. For the first time, a young mechanic with limited resources could walk into a shop and buy aluminum heads, exotic cam grinders, and specially designed intake manifolds rather than having to fabricate them himself from aircraft surplus or junkyard castings. These shops became the laboratories where the real experimentation began. Vic Edelbrock Jr., who had grown up literally sweeping the floors of his father's shop, was now becoming a force in his own right. He worked with legendary engine builders like Bobby Meeks, tuning and dynoing engines in ways that had never been done before. When the Chevrolet small block engine finally arrived in 1955, Edelbrock was one of the first to receive 3 test units. He ran one on the dynamometer, tested multi-carb manifolds on another, and gave the third to a boat builder named Henry Lauterbach, who immediately set 2 world records in Miami. But the real innovation came from the younger generation, the servicemen who had returned with both knowledge and hunger. Ed Iskandarian, after his service in the Army Air Corps, did something audacious. He bought a used cylindrical grinder for $600, converted it into a cam grinding machine, and started making camshafts in the back of a friend's shop in 1946. His first fast-action cam was priced at $30. It worked. Within months, hot rodders across Southern California were asking for Iski cams, and a legend was born. What made these early entrepreneurs different from mechanics of the past was that they understood both the engineering and the business. They advertised. Iskandarian was one of the first to buy an ad in the newly launched Hot Rod magazine, the second issue, in 1948. He understood that getting your name in front of motivated buyers mattered. So did Edelbrock. So did Paul Chappell. They were not just fixing cars, they were building brands. In the immediate post-war period, there was no sanctioned racing. The dry lake beds were technically off-limits, but enforcement was chaotic, and enforcement officers often looked the other way when they saw organized groups showing up with timing equipment rather than a mob of street racers. By 1947, informal racing was happening again. The El Mirage Dry Lake saw its first post-war runs. Muroc, which would later be renamed Edwards Air Force Base, saw military personnel and civilians gathering on weekends to set records. These early post-war races were not like the casual timing trials of the 1930s. These were organized events, with multiple classes, with legitimate timing equipment, with builders from competing shops bringing their latest creations. A driver named Stu Hilborn showed up with a streamlined Lakes car that used mechanical fuel injection of his own design technology he'd learned working on aircraft during the war. The car broke 150 miles per hour on the lake. Hilborn saw an opportunity. He started a company, Hilborn Fuel Injection, that would become legendary in both hot rodding and aircraft industries. What bonded these men was not just mechanical skill or competitive drive, it was belonging. In the garages and on the lake beds, they found a community that understood them. They weren't treated as shell-shocked war vets or as potential problems. They were treated as colleagues, as men with valuable knowledge, as builders. The brotherhood that had formed in wartime repair shops, the camaraderie, the mutual respect, the sense of being part of something larger than yourself, found a new home in hot rodding. The racing events themselves became almost ceremonial. Drivers would show up hours before dawn, tow their cars across the desert on roads that barely existed. They'd time their runs with handheld stopwatches at first, recording every tenth of a second. When a driver hit a new record, there was a real celebration, not just personal triumph, but validation that the modifications worked, that the engineering was sound, that the builder had understood something fundamental about machines that others hadn't yet grasped. One of the most important technical breakthroughs of the early hot rod era was the shift to aluminum. During the war, aluminum had been a strategic material, controlled and rationed. Builders working on military aircraft had learned to work with it, to understand its properties, to recognize that it was lighter and stronger than iron if you engineered it correctly. In the immediate post-war period, there was aluminum everywhere. Military surplus-filled junkyards, aircraft belly tanks, bomb casings, fuselage sections. A creative builder could see these surplus materials not as scrap but as raw materials for high-performance machines. Ed Iskandarian and others would study Offenhauser racing engines, the legendary four-cylinder engines that had dominated Indianapolis for decades, to understand how to shape cam lobes. The Offenhauser used sophisticated aluminum construction, precision, machined to tolerances that had once been exclusive to racing. Now, in the hands of talented post-war mechanics, similar techniques were being applied to hot rods. Vic Edelbrock began producing aluminum cylinder heads specifically designed for the Flathead V8. By tuning the combustion chamber shape and increasing compression ratio, he could extract performance gains that seemed almost miraculous. By 1946, the Edelbrock catalogue had expanded to include not just manifolds, but heads, pistons, flywheels, and cams. The innovation was exponential. Each new part enabled new possibilities. When someone discovered that an exotic overhead cam conversion could work on a V8, builders started experimenting. The modifications were unlimited. But the truly revolutionary insight was this: performance wasn't a black art, it was engineering. You could measure it on a dynamometer, which Edelbrock had purchased in 1948, one of the first engine dynos in America. You could graph it. You could predict it. This democratized knowledge in a way that pre-war hot rodding had not. A mechanic without formal training, but with access to the right information, could build an engine that would compete with factory engineering. Early experimentation was not always successful. When Edelbrock started working on the new small block Chevrolet in 1955, the company encountered serious problems. The first cam installed in the test engine caused it to run rough, missing and popping constantly. Engineers changed the carburetor, adjusted the ignition, but nothing worked. Then someone realized the cam timing marks hadn't been checked against the crankshaft marks. They were off by one tooth. It was a small oversight that could have crashed the entire engine. Once corrected, the car ran beautifully. These were the kinds of problems that defined the early period. Each solution generated 10 new questions. Every breakthrough came after multiple failures. But the difference between this era and the pre-war period was that the knowledge was being shared, documented, and preserved. When Iskandarian developed his E4 street cam and E2 race cam, he published the specifications. When Edelbrock discovered a cam configuration that worked, the information ended up in catalogues and magazines. Hot Rod magazine, which launched in 1948 under the stewardship of Robert E. Peterson, became the nervous system of this emerging culture. Each issue featured new innovations, new builders, new ideas. By 1950, the magazine had a circulation of 300,000. Builders read about what others were doing and applied those lessons to their own work. The speed of innovation accelerated. What would have taken a decade to spread in the pre-war era now took months. The negative image of hot rodders threatened to derail the entire movement before it really had a chance to flourish. Local authorities worried about street racing. Safety advocates pointed to accidents. Media portrayed hot rodders as reckless teenagers in stolen cars. By the late 1940s, the culture that was emerging from the garages and lake beds faced serious pressure from law enforcement and civic organizations. In January 1948, something audacious happened. A group of hot rod builders and enthusiasts organized the first hot rod exhibition at the National Guard Armory in Los Angeles. They were making a statement: "We are not criminals, we are craftsmen." The exhibit emphasized engineering, safety, and the legitimate mechanical achievements of the builders. 10,000 spectators attended. The exhibit was packed with meticulously built cars, technical displays explaining modifications, and drivers discussing their work seriously and professionally. The exhibition worked. It transformed public perception. Suddenly, hot rodding was not something happening in the shadows. It was something that could be discussed in mainstream Los Angeles. It was engineering, it was art, it was youth culture, but it was youth culture with craftsmanship. By the early 1950s, hot rod culture was moving from underground to mainstream. It was appearing in movies. Young people were reading about it in magazines and newspapers. Building a hot rod was becoming not just an eccentric hobby, but an aspirational goal for an entire generation. By the early 1950s, what had started as garage tinkering had become a genuine industry. Paul Chappell's speed shop on San Fernando Road and Bell Auto Supply in neighboring Bell were no longer just suppliers. They were headquarters. They were where builders gathered. They were where knowledge was exchanged. They were where business deals were made. Some of the most successful hot rodders made the leap to legitimate business. Bobby Meeks, who had worked as Vic Edelbrock Sr.'s head mechanic, became a legend in his own right, known for building engines that could consistently outperform what competitors were producing. Young builders who had started in garages, people like SoCal Speed Shop founder Alex Zidius, opened their own shops and began taking customers. Speed equipment manufacturing became an actual economic sector. This transition from hobby to business happened relatively quickly, and it had a crucial effect: it professionalized the culture. When you're building cars for paying customers, you can't cut corners, you can't guess. You have to know what you're doing. This quality control actually accelerated innovation. Because reputation mattered, builders invested in better equipment, better techniques, and better documentation of their work. The entrepreneurs of this era understood something important. They were not just selling parts, they were selling identity. A young man who bought Isky cams for his engine was buying membership in a community. He was buying the reputation of the people who built those cams. He was buying the promise that his engine would run like a champion's engine. Marketing in hot rod culture wasn't separate from the actual product, it was integral to it. By the early 1950s, the dry lake beds north of Los Angeles had become pilgrimage sites. On weekends, hundreds of hot rodders would make the drive to El Mirage or Muroc, towing their cars in trailers or driving them down. The events were not spontaneous chaos. They were organized by the SCTA, Southern California Timing Association, which had reformed in 1947. They had classes for different engine sizes, different body styles. They had rules and records. They had legitimacy. The lakebed races became tests of engineering. A driver would make a run down a marked course, timed electronically or by hand. Times were recorded. If you beat the record for your class, your name went in the book. Your car was photographed. The photograph might end up in Hot Rod magazine. For many of these builders, having a record on the salt flats was not just a personal achievement, it was professional recognition. It was proof that you knew what you were doing. The lakebed culture also had a powerful social dimension. Young men from across Southern California, Pasadena, Glendale, Burbank, Los Angeles proper would make the drive together. They'd work on cars together the night before, staying up late trouble, shooting last-minute problems, helping friends make final adjustments. Then they'd drive to the lake in a caravan, park their cars and trailers in a designated area, and wait for their turn. There was genuinely no other experience quite like it in American youth culture. It combined mechanical skill, competitive drive, genuine danger, and community participation in a way that was unique. Some of the cars that ran on these lake beds became legendary. Stuart Hilborn's Streamliner, with its revolutionary fuel injection, became a template. The SoCal Streamliner, designed by legendary hot rodder Dean Batchelor and built with Edelbrock parts, set records and captured imaginations. These cars were not just fast, they were beautiful. The engineering was not hidden, it was displayed. The cooling vents cut into the hood, the streamlined aluminum body, the polished engine were all on show. Hot rodding was becoming an aesthetic movement, not just a technical one. Out of this culture emerged legendary figures whose names would become synonymous with the movement. Vic Edelbrock Jr. represented the continuation of automotive excellence into a new generation. Ed Iskenderian Isky represented the entrepreneurial spirit of the age. Dean Batchelor represented the fusion of engineering and artistry. Alex Zidius and his SoCal Speed Shop represented the professionalization of speed culture. These were not wealthy men, at least not initially. Many came from working-class backgrounds. Some were immigrants or children of immigrants. What united them was mechanical genius combined with an almost obsessive attention to detail. They understood that in a competitive field, the difference between first place and second place was often a detail that most people would overlook. A cam lobe shaped slightly differently. A manifold ported a fraction of an inch further. An intake runner that was 2 degrees more vertical. These tiny differences could mean the difference between 150 miles per hour and 160 miles per hour. And importantly, they were competitors who also served as collaborators. There was real rivalry between speed shops and builders, but there was also genuine respect. Iskenderian admired Edelbrock's precision. Edelbrock understood Iskenderian's innovative cam designs. When a builder from one shop encountered a problem they couldn't solve, they might actually ask someone from a rival shop for advice. The field was growing fast enough that there was room for everyone who was serious about quality. Hot Rod magazine was crucial to the spread of hot rod culture beyond Los Angeles. By running feature stories on builders and their cars, by documenting new innovations, by running classified ads where builders could reach national audiences, the magazine transformed what had been a regional phenomenon into a national obsession. Young people in Ohio and Michigan read about hot rods in California and began building their own. Hot rod clubs started forming nationwide. Other media picked up the story. By the 1950s, Hollywood was making movies about hot rods. Hot Rod, 1950, The Fast and the Furious, 1955, and others brought hot rod culture to mainstream audiences. These were not high-budget productions, but they captured something real about the culture: the pride in craftsmanship, the competitive drive, the sense of rebellion against conformity. What was spreading was not just technical knowledge, but a cultural narrative, the story of the returning veteran who came home with skills and determination and built something extraordinary from nothing. The story of the working-class kid who taught himself engineering by reading magazines and trial and error. The story of the outsider proving that he was every bit as good as the corporate engineers. These narratives were powerful, and they were true. Enough of them were true that they became the mythology of hot rodding. By the early 1950s, the low-hanging fruit of hot rod modification had been picked. Everyone knew you could get more power by tuning the carburetor, removing the muffler, installing higher compression heads, and smoothing the intake ports. What remained were the more subtle optimizations. How do you extract another 10% of power from an engine? How do you do it reliably? How do you maintain longevity? Vic Edelbrock Jr., working with the new small-block Chevrolet engines that arrived in 1955, began a series of experiments that would define the next phase of hot rod development. He tested different camshaft profiles. He experimented with different port shapes, different compression ratios, different fuel mixtures. He worked with legendary cam grinders like Isky to develop specialized cams for specific applications. In 1958, he achieved something that seemed nearly impossible: 1 horsepower per cubic inch from a 283 cubic inch small-block Chevy engine. That was revolutionary. At the same time, builders like Frank McGurk and others were pushing the boundaries of what was possible with nitromethane fuel. In 1950, Vic Edelbrock had used a secret blend of 20% nitromethane disguised with orange oil scent to power Roger Ward's Shaker midget car to victory at Gilmore Stadium, breaking the long-dominant Offenhauser midget winning streak. Nitromethane allowed engines to run higher boost pressures and hotter combustion temperatures than gasoline could support. It was dangerous, extremely dangerous, but it offered performance gains that were otherwise unavailable. In 1951, the National Hot Rod Association was founded by Wally Parks. The NHRA's mission was to take hot rodding off the streets and onto controlled, sanctioned courses. The NHRA established drag strips, straight, quarter-mile tracks where drivers could race safely and legally. They established classes and rules. They provided insurance. They made hot rodding legitimate. The impact of the NHRA cannot be overstated. Street racing had been a genuine problem in Los Angeles and other cities. Young hot rodders would challenge each other on city streets late at night, creating genuine danger for themselves and innocent bystanders. Law enforcement wanted it stopped. Hot rod leaders wanted an outlet. The NHRA was the solution. It transformed racing from an underground activity into something that civic authorities could support, or at least tolerate. Drag racing also democratized competitive hot rodding. You didn't need access to remote lake beds hundreds of miles away. You could go to your local drag strip on a Saturday night. This rapid expansion meant that hot rod culture spread faster and more widely than it ever could have if it remained dependent on access to California's dry lakes. By the mid-1950s, the best hot rod builders had achieved a kind of technical mastery that was almost Zen-like. They could look at an engine and predict exactly how much power it would make. They could specify modifications and be confident that when the customer drove the car, it would perform as promised. This was not luck or guesswork. This was science applied at the highest level of precision. The engines being built in the late 1950s and early 1960s were marvels. A well-tuned small-block Chevy could produce over 400 horsepower reliably. A big-block engine could approach 500. These numbers seem ordinary now, but in the context of the time when a standard family car produced 150 horsepower, they were astonishing. And they were being achieved by mechanics who had never attended formal engineering school, but who had learned their craft through thousands of hours of experimentation. The cars built during this period achieved a perfect balance between form and function that hot rodding has never quite recaptured. The builders understood that a car needed to handle as well as it could accelerate. They understood aerodynamics. They understood weight distribution. They built cars that were not just fast, but were genuinely engineered machines. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, hot rod culture had thoroughly permeated American youth culture. Teenage boys across the country wanted hot rods. The look of hot rods, the exposed engines, the lowered chassis, the custom paint, began appearing on stock cars straight from the factory. Chevrolet, Ford, and others watched what hot rodders were doing and started offering options that were inspired by hot rod culture. Custom paint, high-performance engines, stiffer suspension. The automotive industry was learning from the culture it had initially dismissed. Hot rod culture also influenced music, fashion, and cinema. Beach movies of the 1960s always featured hot rods. Music groups sang about cars. The Beach Boys' Shut Down was literally about a hot rod race. Little Deuce Coupe was about a modified 32 Ford. Hot rod culture had become so embedded in American teenage life that it seemed like it had always been there. Internationally, hot rodding was even being noticed. Japanese manufacturers began paying attention to what American enthusiasts were doing, seeing it as evidence of where the market was heading. European sports car manufacturers, which had initially dismissed American hot rods as crude and unsophisticated, began to acknowledge that there was genuine engineering sophistication happening in these garage-built machines. Perhaps most importantly, hot rodding had become a pathway for working-class young men to achieve legitimate recognition and economic success. A kid from a poor neighborhood who had an aptitude for machines could open a speed shop, build parts for hot rodders, and become wealthy. This was genuinely meritocratic in a way that much of American society was not. Your race, your family connections, your educational pedigree didn't matter as much as your skill and your willingness to work. For World War II veterans specifically, hot rodding had provided something invaluable, a way to process trauma and transition to civilian life. The psychological benefits went largely unrecognized because no one had the language for what we now call PTSD, but everyone understood that there was something healing about the community, the focus, the sense of achievement that hot rodding provided. Men who had faced the worst of war found in their garages and on the lake beds a way to reclaim their sense of agency and purpose. The cultural significance was also profound. Hot rodding represented a specifically working-class form of innovation. It was not corporate. It was not top-down. It was grassroots engineering. Young men and women figuring out how to make things better with limited resources and unlimited creativity. In an era when technology was increasingly seen as the domain of massive corporations and government agencies, hot rodding proved that innovation could still be democratic, could still come from the ground up. From the chaos of returning soldiers in 1945 to the organized racing culture of the 1950s and early 1960s, hot rodding had been forged by a specific generation in a specific place during a specific moment in history. It required World War II servicemen with mechanical training. It required Southern California's dry lake beds. It required an economy booming enough to provide surplus money and surplus materials. It required magazines and media willing to document what was happening. Remove any of these elements, and the story would have been different. But what emerged from this particular convergence was something that has endured. The hot rods built in the garages of 1950s Los Angeles are still celebrated today. The engineering principles pioneered by Edelbrock and Iskenderian are still used. The community and the culture have evolved, but the fundamental spirit remains. Young people today still build and modify cars with the same passion, the same ingenuity, the same desire to create something personal and powerful. The legacy of the World War II engineers who catalyzed hot rodding extends far beyond cars. They proved that there was more than one way to be an engineer, that formal credentials were less important than understanding, curiosity, and the willingness to experiment. They created a culture where working-class kids could become innovators. They democratized mechanical knowledge, and they gave struggling veterans a way to rebuild their lives and their identities after the war had nearly destroyed them. When those returning soldiers fired up their Flathead V8s in 1946 and 1947, they weren't thinking about creating an enduring American culture. They were just trying to reclaim something they loved, to feel alive again, to prove to themselves that they still controlled their destinies. But out of that simple desire grew something revolutionary. Hot rodding became a template for how communities form around shared passion. It became proof that innovation can flourish outside corporate laboratories, and it remains, to this day, one of the purest expressions of American ingenuity and freedom. The dry lake beds are still there. The spirit that drove those first post-war racers out into the desert, that hunger to go faster, to build better, to prove yourself through excellence, that spirit never left. It lives in every hot rod that runs today. It lives in every young person who looks at a machine and sees not just what it is, but what it could become. That is the real legacy of those World War II engineers. Not just the cars they built, but the permission they gave an entire culture to dream, to experiment, and to refuse to settle for ordinary. We're hunting for stories like this one, the kind that prove ordinary people built extraordinary things. And we need more people like you in this community. People who get it. Subscribe, turn on notifications. The next story is waiting, and it's just as extraordinary as this one. Thank you for watching and lending your ear to a story that deserved to be heard. The engine's just warming up.